This morning, it's my great pleasure to welcome Daniel McCrum from the School of Civil Engineering. He's going to be talking about the fascinating topic of combined cyber and physical threats to transport infrastructure. So thanks very much for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Taz, and thanks to Emily and Will as well for arranging this. I've been in UCD for 3 years now, 3.5 years, and I was explaining to the guys that I thought I was a member of the Earth Institute for a while because I was getting the emails, and then it turned out I wasn't. So hence why I'm giving this presentation now. I'm an official member as of a few months ago. So as I said, I'm in civil engineering, and what I'm going to discuss today is combined cyber and physical threats to critical infrastructure. So I'll initially explain what that is and the background. So I have two projects running in this one. One is a current PhD student, Costas, which is funded by the UCD Advanced PhD scheme. And then the second one is the Horizon 2020 project, which will be up and running by Q4. So I'll explain that later. They're both in this area. So I thought I'd go through these kind of topics. So first off, I think I'd kind of like to start off with, well, what is a cyber physical threat? Maybe just explaining what it is. So this example isn't in the civil engineering realm, but it's quite a widely published example. Now, many of these examples are never published because organizations don't want their cyber vulnerability published, so to speak. So it can be quite hard to actually find concrete examples, so to speak. So here, this is happened in Ukraine in 2015. This is the power station. So they have a generating plant which is connected to a control center, and then the generating plant has transmission substations and distribution substations which sends the electricity to your homes, your commercial and industrial. So what happened was attackers got into the control system, and they had access to the computers, they had access to their SCADA system, which controlled the transmission substations. And they were in they had hacked in for 6 months, and they were hiding away in there for 6 months. And then they decided to, on a particular day, to cut off several of the substations. In different literature, it says different amounts, but 7 substations is what probably the most published. And this led to 225,000 people losing power to their homes. So it's a cyber attack which has an impact on the physical system. So that's what a cyber physical threat or attack is. Moving into more civil engineering side of things, relating to transportation in particular, here are 2 examples. One example was in Poland in 2008. 4 trams were derailed by a 14-year-old. 12 people were injured. And what happened was the 14-year-old used a TV remote control, the infrared communication system in a TV remote control, plus other gadgets, which you can see on the right-hand side of that image, to take control of the system, okay, and ended up derailing 4 trams. And thankfully, people were only injured and there were no deaths. In 2018, another example is a denial of service attack on the Danish state rail operator. So there was a day, I don't know the date offhand, in 2018, where their ticketing and communication systems, they couldn't use them. Okay, so people were going to train stations and couldn't use their tickets, couldn't use, and the communication had broken down within the state rail operator. So these are cyber attacks, but they have physical impacts on they have impacts on the physical systems. So this is the area that got me interested, and this is the PhD student Costas, who's the co-supervisor is assistant professor Liliana Pasquale in computer science. So I'm the civil engineer, Liliana is the computer engineer, and Costas is working on this project. And what we're trying to do is come up with a risk framework for cyber physical threats, initially cyber physical threats to transportation infrastructure, particularly if you look at the image on the left around the area of the Internet of Things, smart cities. So more and more are, in this image, for example, you can see the vehicles are all talking to each other, the traffic light system, etc. The tram is talking to the traffic light system as well. But physical infrastructure like bridges can be, monitored for their structural health. And all of this information can potentially be subjected to a cyber attack that can have a physical impact on the system. So the way we've approached it, and in the next slide, I might go into a bit more, I'll go into more detail, but these assets, for example, the physical assets, but also assets like, for example, if you're the owner operator of the tram system, for example, or whatever the case may be, you are an asset in yourself in terms of the reputation that you have, okay? So it's not just the physical sensors or the physical infrastructure that has an asset value. When we're talking about cyber, other aspects also have a value. So we take that value into account. We take the threat source. Where is this threat coming from? Okay, so is it an individual like the tram example I mentioned, or is it something more sophisticated like the Danish rail example? Okay, and then we look at the vulnerability of the systems as well. Okay, so the cyber physical systems, and in the vulnerability we're taking into account things like, does the attacker physically need to be at that location to do it? Because if they do, that's much harder to do, for example, maybe in certain scenarios. Or is it only possible to attack the system remotely, or do they need to be local or physically there? Okay, but we're also looking at things like, what's the complexity of that threat source? So there's different types of cyber attacks, the denial of service attack, that could be the, different types of attacks. So we have to take the complexity of those into account when assessing the vulnerability of the system. And then we put these all together and they give us a risk. So far, this is where we're at. We're still working on this, but this is a very simplified version of the calculations, maybe to give you a bit more insight in terms of the framework. So at the moment, it's qualitative. And as I mentioned, the assets, things like the operator of the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure itself, the data that you're getting from the infrastructure, is it confidential? Okay, is the data complete? Maybe because of the attack, the data won't be complete. And then the safety of people, like the example in the tram, for example, 12 people were injured, So all of these values of the assets have to be taken into account. We multiply them by, there's a bit more to the threat source assessment than just this figure, but if you get the concept that an individual who's just doing it for their own ego has very basic computer skills, so it's a low level threat source, for example. Whereas if a national organization decides to attack your infrastructure, it's a very high level of threat source, okay? So there's a bit more behind that, but just as a concept, that's probably good enough for now. And then, as I mentioned, the vulnerability assessment, we're taking into account the attack vector. For example, do they physically have to be there? Is it a local attack or a remote attack? And also the complexity of the attack, because the attack or the threat, sorry, and the attack, they link together with the asset as well, really. So the idea here is that, whoever's doing this, maybe it's a critical infrastructure operator, we've created bands so that they can choose whether they think they're at a level 4, a level 6, or a level 7, 8, 9, or 10, for example. So we're still working on this, obviously, so still a bit to go. So that's Kostas's work on his PhD. And what we're now moving on to is we're looking at specific case studies. We do kind of have to create our own case study to a certain extent, because published like infrastructure operators, they're not keen on saying these are our vulnerabilities, so to speak. So we have to kind of do a slight hypothetical. So here in the top left, we have, this is a cyber physical system. We have sensors on a bridge, and these sensors are measuring the structural performance of the bridge, okay? So there's a communication protocol between the sensors and the gateway. So these are wireless devices, and that could be susceptible to an attack. Okay, that's one of our hypothetical scenarios, for example. And this information is then sent locally to a network up to the cloud, and then to your remote control station, where you typically will get a report just stating what's going on in terms of the structural health monitoring of your system. So the cyber threats that can happen are at the transmission layer, like this example, and in the perception layer, which are the sensors. There's also the application layer, which I couldn't fit into the figure here, and that would be your IT systems, for example. But one of the real novelties that we're moving forward with in this project, you see the physical threats on the bottom. You think, well, why am I showing those physical threats? Well, what if you have a physical attack followed by a cyber attack? So these physical threats could be an earthquake, a flood, a terrorist bombing, whatever the case may be. Okay, how do these affect the vulnerability of your cyber physical system? So is it more likely that you'll be attacked in a cyber attack after one of these physical threats, for example? And the answer is more than likely yes, but we don't know how to quantify this yet, and it's never been done. So that's one of the real novelties that we're looking at in this project. Moving on now, this is PRECINCT is the name. This is Horizon 2020. This funding call is on combined cyber and physical threats to critical infrastructure. This call has been on the go for 5 years. I've been involved in this. This is my third attempt, and we finally got in this time, thankfully. But what's happened over the few years is that individually over the years, they've been focusing on individual critical infrastructure. So if you see number 5 along the bottom there, you can see you have air travel, you have rail, you have road, you have water infrastructure, you have communication infrastructure and energy infrastructure. So individually, they've been focusing on those over the last maybe 4 years. And this year, the focus is on the interdependencies between these critical infrastructures. So they're really interested this year, and this project PRECINCT is about PRECINCT, I suppose, in itself is looking at the localized area under consideration. So it could be the city center, or it could be a specific transport hub or whatever. But for example, your traffic light system in your transport network is directly affected by the communication systems and by the okay. So what we plan to do in this project, if you're looking at numbers 3 and 4, number 3 is where, sorry, I should say the people involved in this, apologies. So Professor Eugene O'Brien is involved in this, Assistant Professor Porrick Carroll and Associate Professor Francesco Pila are all involved in this project. So sorry, coming back. In terms of the vulnerability assessment tool that we're going to come up with, we're going to use a serious games approach to do this. This will help us identify unknown vulnerabilities. I'll go into that in a little more. I have 2 more slides left. And I'll go into the serious game approach in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. But what the serious games approach to vulnerability assessment will be linked directly to, we'll create a digital twin of this PRECINCT or ecosystem that we're trying to understand the interdependencies between the critical infrastructures for cyber physical threats. Okay, that's a mouthful in itself, I suppose. But what we're trying to do is we create a digital model of the actual infrastructure, these critical infrastructures, and that will help us understand their current state, so to speak. And we're going to implement all of this in a living lab. There's 3 living labs. One is in Ljubljana, one is in Athens, and the other is in Genoa. I'm pretty sure it's Genoa. But we're also going to have kind of much more minor demonstrator sites, one of which is Smart Sandyford here in Dublin. So we will be implementing part of this in Smart Sandyford in Dublin. So this is my second last slide. So this is the digital twin. And so what the digital twin is, it's a computer model, it's a physical model representation of the physical critical infrastructure. And then we have to, if you look along the bottom, for example, you see that the data sources, so these infrastructure are monitored or they have data coming from them. So the structural health monitoring bridge example I gave, an example could be one of these where you're getting information from sensors. It could be your traffic light systems, okay? It could be anything along those lines, any information that we're getting within our smart city relating to critical infrastructure. So we have however many of these infrastructures we have. And what the digital twin will bring together is that it will use algorithms to be able to understand if there's any anomalies in the data, if there's any threat sources coming from the changes in the data, for example. And then we'll be able to inform ourselves, about, what execution plan to put in place to minimize this threat, and what should be the threat response. Okay, so the digital twin is just going to create a platform for doing that. But part of that is really looking at the overall resilience as well of the interdependencies of this critical infrastructure. Okay, and we're going to, I mean, it sounds quite complicated, but hopefully we'll be able to break it down to be a bit more straightforward. But to help us understand the vulnerability of these systems, well, the way we are approaching this in this project, and this is the part that UCD will be quite heavily involved, as well as the living labs, is we're looking at a serious game approach where we have, so confidential people will work within maybe the infrastructure owner, you know, within the company themselves. So obviously this isn't data you want outside of your company, people trying to attack it and understand your vulnerabilities. But the idea would be that if we went for an approach where you just, if we just programmed in options that people could do in relation to attacks, how are we ever going to find unanticipated threats, unanticipated combination of threats, or potentially cascading effects? How will we ever find them? And the idea would be we would rely on the ingenuity of people to do that. So we'd have attackers within this game. This is a map-based this is our kind of broad idea that it would be a map-based game platform, so to speak. And you'll have defenders as well. So for example, you're going to attack the water system, and what cascading effects does that have on other aspects of critical infrastructure, like your transportation, maybe. Okay, but how can you defend them as well? So the idea would be this approach could be used for training purposes as well. So it's not just about updating the game live, but we kind of see this as a really good way of training to understand how you can improve the resilience of your precinct, so to speak, or this ecosystem within your precinct. So that's the two projects that I've kind of working on at the minute within this area. It's an area that I'm quite interested in developing future. And we have a funded proposal in with SFI as well for something in similar to, not PRECINCT, but something within this area again as well. So it's an area quite actively pursuing. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm not sure if my PhD student or Liliana are on the project as well, or others who might be interested in piping in and showing, you know, providing their 2 cents as well. So thanks very much everyone for listening, and happy to discuss.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Daniel. That's fascinating. It's the kind of stuff you hear about in the news and see in movies all the time, but really great to get some proper insight into the process and the battle to try and stop it from happening. Does anybody have any questions?
I do, Taz, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. That was really interesting talk, as Taz says. You know, you sort of see it on TV. I guess I saw the report, the World Economic Forum, I think it was last year, announced that, you know, I think the 5 top risks are now climate related or environment related, replacing kind of financial and political or geopolitical. Do you have a sense of, you know, you mentioned there the coincidence of, say, a natural hazard with one of these cyber attacks. Do you have a sense, like a relative feel about, you know, the occurrence of these things, you know, given climate risk now that we're all focusing on, how they're playing out relative to each other? Or, you know, what have your readings on this or past case studies might tell you? Is that a fair assessment?
So I think, I mean, well, the climate change aspect, I suppose, will directly affect the reoccurrence of natural hazards. So if you think about in the first project my PhD student is doing, we're not directly looking at climate change, but we're starting to look at the physical event, so to speak. And climate change could be one of those physical events. I don't think we're going to look at that at this stage because it's probably a bit too much for where we're at in that project. But absolutely, yes, it would have an impact on the frequency of these events occurring, particularly flooding events, maybe landslides, events like that. So what we're trying to see is, will that have an impact on the cyber vulnerability, so to speak, of these systems? And we believe it probably will. The PRECINCT project will do that as well, using the serious games approach. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to, I can't recall offhand if climate change is included in that or not. But that would be my kind of feeling about how this could impact it. And it definitely would impact it, particularly from the physical event occurring first, for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll follow up actually. I might drop you an email. I'd be interested in chatting to you more about it, but thanks. I really enjoyed your talk.
There's a comment there from Costas. I'll probably direct events are more correlated to cyber attacks. Do you want to comment further, Costas? You're welcome to join in verbally.
Hi all, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Daniel, that was a great presentation. It was very helpful.
Well, you have to say that, don't you?
Yeah, but I'm not involved in the whole project. You know, in the last part, it's part of your postdoc, right?
Yeah, that'll be starting in Q4 at some stage.
Yeah, it was very good. Regarding the climate change and the correlation with the cyber attacks, yeah, probably. But if you want to be direct, probably natural hazards like earthquake or floods events may be more correlated than climate change that would affect more aging infrastructure, for example. So what's the problem with this is that emergency plans don't involve events, two events like a cyber attack that could follow a natural hazard and vice versa. So probably they have to go a step back and introduce these new threats for infrastructures. For example, it would be easier for an attacker to conduct an attack to an infrastructure after an earthquake, right? So, of course, climate change is an indirect event because it's more harmful for aging infrastructures. But an attacker may want to wait for the right moment where the emergency plans are starting and somehow to disrupt them.
That's really interesting. My question, I was curious about the degree to which you're able to simulate or replicate the real system in the serious games framework. Is it a pretty accurate model? You're able to play out those kinds of scenarios in a lot of detail.
One of the partners, Neuro Games, that we're partnering with, they'll be developing the game, and they've developed games previously. In a previous incarnation of this, you know, we were looking at one of the previous unsuccessful funding proposals we had was just focusing on the serious games by themselves. So it will be somewhat of a watered down version within this this proposal. But the idea would be that we were thinking that you could visualize and update, you know, so there were two aspects. One was training and seeing how your infrastructure, so they could be like little score boxes, you know, beside the infrastructures, and they could just be yellow or green, yellow, or green, amber, and red, for example, telling you that, you know, you need to focus in on this one. But we'll have to wait and see, I suppose, in this project, how sophisticated that gameplay will be. Yeah, we have ideas how we would like it to be as sophisticated as possible, but that may not happen in reality, you know. But we do envisage it to be some sort of a physical visual as well, not just clicking some boxes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, congratulations on getting the project, by the way, at the third time of asking. That's
yeah. Well, Eugene is being the fourth time of asking, so we've kept plugging away, and we got there in the end.
Brilliant.
Could I just comment, Taz, on that? I think failure is part of the process, and this is an example where perseverance eventually resulted in success.
Yeah, no, it's a really good message. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? The other thing that I was interested in was I mean, it's quite an interesting combination of different kind of skill sets and expertise. Are there many people that kind of have a bit of both, have the cyber and computer science expertise as well as the civil engineering expertise, or is it really necessarily a truly interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary kind of approach that you have to take?
Yeah, well, we found it has been a truly interdisciplinary approach. So Liliana in computer engineering, we wouldn't be where we are in terms of Costas's work without her input, you know. It truly is, we haven't, like, I suppose in the future, maybe, you know, 10 years down the line, maybe you will need engineers with these skills, if you know what I mean, because they could be half computer engineers, half civil engineers. But what we have found is we've had to learn, well, Costas had to learn a lot of new skills. Particularly, Costas comes from a civil engineering background, so he's very good at doing the physical vulnerability to these events, but he's had to learn how to do the cyber side of things. So, but in the future, you know, we could get someone on the cyber side who could complement that, if you know what I mean. They'd be very good on the cyber and have to learn the physical. But we have found that kind of, those skill sets don't necessarily exist, the two together.
I guess the same challenge lies for the people that are trying to attack the system. They must have some degree of understanding of both sides of it. But I was fascinated by your kind of taxonomy of potential attackers, from individuals through to groups, through to nations. It sounds as though some nations in particular are really investing heavily in this kind of approach. And I mean, how pervasive do you think it is at a national level? You know, it hits the headlines from time to time, but it strikes me that it must be something that's going on.
Well, for example, the Ukrainian example I gave at the very start, it's very hard to find any published information in this area. And this is part of the reason why we're doing a framework, because we believe we can publish a framework, but you couldn't necessarily publish a case study that identifies, well, here's the Boyne Bridge in Dublin or in Drogheda. If you want to attack it, here's how to attack it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but the example in Ukraine, I mean, it's never been proven, but they suspected Russian state were behind it, you know. So, I mean, very much the prevalence of this, and, you know, 90% of the research in this area is the cyber physical. Not so much in civil engineering physical, but there's nothing really in the reverse direction, the physical cyber. So, as you said, the skill sets really appear to be, they can get into these systems, but maybe if they were civil engineers, they'd be able to do something else, you know, if they had that background. Maybe they'd be able to look at more vulnerabilities they hadn't considered previously. But the majority of my feeling for this is the majority of what happens is they get in, it's never published, and the company says nothing, you know, it's very much what happens. So, but I mean, organizations are being attacked multiple times on a daily basis, you know, certain organizations. So it's, from the cyber perspective, you know, it's a huge issue and huge burden for them as well.
Constant, yeah. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up?
So before we do, I'm happy, my email address is up there, daniel.mccrum@ucd.ie. If anyone wants to contact me afterwards and start up a conversation separately, that's no problem at all.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Daniel. That really was fascinating, and thanks everyone for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks very much, Taz.
Cheers, thanks.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Dan.